So thanks to this decision, we can now promptly file to proceed with these numerous policies and those that have been wrongly enjoined on a nationwide basis, including birthright citizenship, ending sanctuary city funding, suspending refugee resettlement, freezing unnecessary funding, stopping federal taxpayers from paying for transgender surgeries, and numerous other priorities of the American people.
U.S. President Donald Trump has praised a ruling by the Supreme Court that limits the ability of federal judges to block presidential orders nationwide. The decision relates to Trump's efforts to end automatic citizenship for all babies born on American soil. Democrats are calling the ruling a dangerous step toward authoritarianism.
America's highest court has just handed the US president more power and judges less. The 6 conservative Supreme Court justices voted against the 3 liberals to stop lower court judges from blocking presidential orders nationwide if a policy was challenged in one state. The Supreme Court decision was related to a case about birthright citizenship. That's a law that grants all babies born on US soil American citizenship, whether their parents are citizens or not. It's one of the many laws that Donald Trump has sought to change using executive orders.
Okay, so imagine the Supreme Court calls you in to answer questions about whether you've been violating the Constitution, the highest court in the land, the final arbiter of what's legal and what's not. They've just struck down more than 30 of your executive orders. They've ruled 7-2, including 3 justices you appointed, that you've been overstepping your authority, that you've been trying to grab powers the Constitution doesn't give you, and instead of defending your actions or explaining your reasoning, you just walk out, you leave. You refuse to engage with the judicial process. That's what Donald Trump just did, and it's one of the most brazen acts of constitutional defiance we've ever seen from us. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Well, yesterday's decision has drastically limited the judiciary's power to rein in the president's decisions and to control him. And it comes on top of another Supreme Court decision last year, Trump versus United States, that has established a very vast and very broad understanding of the immunity of president's power when he acts in official capacity. And even more importantly, I think the current Republican Congress is unwilling to take its control and its checks and balances power. And that's very important, that they basically give him a free pass of whatever he wants to do.
Right, you say a free pass. So are there any limits to this power, or is it just a free pass throughout?
Well, the judiciary system in the United States is a very complex system. We have the Supreme Court, but we have district courts and federal courts, and we have local courts and local judges. And all of them, they can comment upon certain aspects of legislation and executive power. So it's not a free pass per se, but it has dramatically increased his ability for his vast power.
This happened on October 26th. The Supreme Court was conducting what's essentially an oversight review session. They wanted answers about Trump's executive actions, about his use of military force domestically, about his claims that he might be entitled to a 3rd term, about his attempts to take control of state National Guard units, about his efforts to override laws passed by Congress. These aren't minor issues. These are fundamental questions about the limits of presidential power, about whether we have a system of checks and balances, or whether the president can just do whatever he wants. And Trump's response? He walked out, just got up and left, refused to participate, refused to answer questions, refused to acknowledge that the Supreme Court has any authority to review his actions. That's not how this is supposed to work. The president doesn't get to ignore the Supreme Court. The judiciary is a co-equal branch of government. Their job is to check executive power. And when they say you've crossed the line, you don't get to just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. But that's exactly what Trump did, and he did it right after the court issued a massive 7-2 ruling against him. A ruling that struck down over 30 executive orders. A ruling that said Trump has been trying to claim powers that don't exist under the Constitution. A ruling that 3 of Trump's own appointees joined. Think about that. The justices Trump put on the court, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, they voted against him. They said his claims of unlimited executive authority are wrong, that he's been violating constitutional limits, that his actions are unlawful. This is huge because Trump has spent his entire presidency, both terms, pushing the boundaries of executive power, claiming he has absolute authority over basically everything, saying Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the power to do whatever he wants, testing how far he can go before someone stops him. And now the Supreme Court has drawn a line. They've said, no, you don't have unlimited power. You can't just do whatever you want. The Constitution still means something, and you're bound by it whether you like it or not. The ruling invalidated Trump's attempts to take control of independent agencies, his efforts to federalize state National Guard units without governor's consent, his claims that he can override congressional statutes through executive action, his assertions that he has inherent authority to deploy military force domestically without constitutional restrictions, all of it struck down, declared unconstitutional, ruled to be violations of separation of powers and federalism principles that are fundamental to American government. And Trump's team had been hinting, not so subtly, that he might try to stay in office beyond 2 terms, that maybe the constitutional limit doesn't really apply to him, that there might be ways around the 22nd Amendment. Legal scholars and constitutional experts have been sounding alarms about this for months, saying that Trump is laying groundwork to refuse to leave office when his term ends, that he's testing whether anyone will stop him if he just ignores the Constitution. And now, with this walkout, he's showing that he has no intention of respecting constitutional limits on his power. The Supreme Court is supposed to be the final word on what's constitutional, but what happens when the president just refuses to acknowledge their authority? What happens when he walks out of oversight sessions? What happens when he ignores their rulings and does whatever he wants anyway? We're in uncharted territory here because the system of checks and balances only works if everyone agrees to participate. If the president decides he's above the law, above the courts, above the Constitution itself, then we're not a democracy anymore. We're something else, something dangerous. Let's break down exactly what happened and what it means. All right, so let's talk about the Supreme Court ruling that triggered Trump's walkout. On October 23rd, the court issued a landmark 7-2 decision, and it was devastating for Trump's legal position. The majority opinion, which included Chief Justice Roberts and Trump's 3 appointees, plus the liberal justices, systematically dismantled Trump's claims of expansive executive power. They looked at more than 30 executive orders that Trump had issued, orders that claim broad presidential authority over areas that traditionally belong to Congress or the states. And they said, these are unconstitutional. These exceed the president's authority under Article 2. These violate separation of powers. The specific issues were varied, but they all came down to the same basic question. How much power does the president actually have under the Constitution? Trump's position has always been that Article 2 gives him essentially unlimited authority. That as president, he can do basically anything he wants as long as he claims it's related to his constitutional duties. That Congress can't really constrain him, that states can't resist him, that he's the most powerful person in government and everyone else has to defer to him. But the Supreme Court said no, that's not how it works. The Constitution creates a system of separated powers. Congress makes laws, the president enforces them, the courts interpret them, and there are limits on each branch. The president can't just make up powers that aren't in the Constitution. He can't override laws that Congress passed. He can't commandeer state governments to do his bidding. These are basic principles of American constitutional law, and Trump has been violating them repeatedly. One of the biggest issues in the case was Trump's use of military force domestically. He's been deploying federal troops and federalizing National Guard units to enforce immigration policy in cities across the country, sending soldiers into Democratic-led jurisdictions, whether the governors and mayors want them there or not. And he's been claiming that as commander-in-chief, he has absolute authority to use military force however he sees fit. That the Posse Comitatus Act, which restricts military involvement in domestic law enforcement, doesn't really limit him. That state control over National Guard units can be overridden whenever he wants. The Supreme Court rejected all of that. They said the president's commander-in-chief power is limited, that it doesn't authorize domestic military deployments for law enforcement purposes without congressional authorization, that states retain authority over their National Guard units unless there's a proper federal activation under constitutional guidelines, that Trump's claims of unlimited military authority are exactly the kind of executive overreach the Constitution was designed to prevent. This is a huge rebuke because Trump has been using military deployment as one of his signature tactics, and the court just told him it's illegal. Another major issue was Trump's attempts to control independent agencies. These are agencies like the Federal Reserve or the Federal Trade Commission that are supposed to operate independently from direct presidential control. They have specific missions defined by Congress, And while the president appoints their leaders, he's not supposed to be able to fire them at will or direct their day-to-day operations. That independence is important because these agencies make decisions that need to be insulated from political pressure. But Trump has been trying to assert direct control over these agencies, claiming that under Article 2, all executive power belongs to him, that there's no such thing as independent agencies. They all answer to the president. And if their leaders don't do what he wants, he can just fire them and replace them with loyalists. The Supreme Court said, nope, Congress has the power to create independent agencies. They can structure them in ways that limit presidential control. And Trump can't just override congressional decisions about agency structure because he doesn't like independence. Then there's the third term issue. Trump and his allies have been floating ideas about how he might be able to stay in office beyond 2 terms. Maybe the 22nd Amendment doesn't really count because his first term was supposedly stolen by the Russia investigation. Maybe there are emergency powers that would let him extend his presidency. Maybe he could step down temporarily and then run again. These are all completely insane theories with no constitutional basis, but Trump keeps hinting at them, keeps suggesting he might not leave office when his term ends, and that's terrifying. The Supreme Court didn't directly rule on the third term question because Trump hasn't actually tried to do it yet, but their opinion made clear that the president is bound by constitutional limits, that he can't just make up new powers or reinterpret clear constitutional text to suit his preferences, that the 22nd Amendment means what it says, no person can be elected president more than twice, period, no exceptions, no creative interpretations, and if Trump tries to violate that, the courts will stop him. The 7-2 split is significant. The only dissenters were Justices Thomas and Alito, the court's most conservative members, who have extremely broad views of executive power, but everyone else, including all 3 Trump appointees, voted with the majority. That tells you how extreme Trump's position is. Even the justices he put on the court, who were supposed to be loyal to him, couldn't go along with his claims of unlimited authority. They're conservative, they generally favor strong executive power, but even they have limits, and Trump has gone way beyond those limits. Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion that was particularly pointed. He said that the president's oath is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, not to maximize presidential power, that the framers deliberately created a system of limited government, that no one, not even the president, is above the law, and that Trump's theories of executive authority would essentially turn the president into a king, which is exactly what the Constitution was designed to prevent. Coming from a Trump appointee, that's a devastating critique. After the ruling came down, the Supreme Court scheduled an oversight session. They wanted to hear from Trump's legal team about how the administration would comply with the decision, about which executive orders would be rescinded, about what changes would be made to bring presidential actions into constitutional compliance. This is unusual. The court doesn't normally hold these kinds of sessions, but given the scope of Trump's constitutional violations and his history of defying court orders, they apparently felt direct oversight was necessary. And that's when Trump walked out. He showed up, or his lawyers did. But when it became clear that the justices were going to press hard on compliance and accountability, Trump himself reportedly got up and left, just walked out of the session. His lawyers tried to continue, but Trump's departure sent a clear message. He doesn't think he has to answer to the Supreme Court. He doesn't think their rulings apply to him. He's going to do what he wants, regardless of what they say. Legal scholars are calling this unprecedented. Presidents have disagreed with Supreme Court rulings before. They've criticized decisions. They've dragged their feet on implementation. But actually walking out of an oversight session, refusing to engage with the judicial process, that's new. That's a level of defiance and disrespect for the rule of law that we haven't seen before. And it raises a fundamental question. If the president won't comply with Supreme Court rulings, what happens? The court doesn't have an enforcement arm. They rely on the executive branch to implement their decisions. If the president just says no, what's the remedy? Okay, so let's break down what this means and where we go from here. First, the immediate legal situation. Trump has been ordered by the Supreme Court to rescind over 30 executive orders, to stop certain military deployments, to restore independence to federal agencies, to operate within constitutional limits. But he's signaling through his walkout that he has no intention of complying. So what happens? Congress could impeach him for violating the Constitution, but Republicans control the House and they're not going to do that. Courts could hold him in contempt, but how do you enforce contempt orders against the president? The military could refuse to follow unconstitutional orders, but Trump has been purging military leadership and installing loyalists. We're in a constitutional crisis. Second, the separation of powers implications. The whole system of American government is based on 3 co-equal branches checking each other. Congress makes laws, the president executes them, courts interpret them, and no branch is supreme. But Trump is asserting that he is supreme, that as president he can ignore Congress and defy courts and do whatever he wants. That's not a republic. That's not democracy. And if he gets away with it, if there are no consequences for walking out on the Supreme Court, then the Constitution doesn't really mean anything anymore. Third, the precedent this sets. Future presidents will look at what Trump did and think, if he could ignore the Supreme Court, why can't I? If he could claim unlimited executive power, why should I respect limits? Trump is teaching future leaders that norms don't matter, that rules are for other people, that if you're willing to be bold enough and defiant enough, you can get away with anything. And that's terrifying regardless of your political views, because someday there will be a president you disagree with and you'll want the Constitution to constrain them. But if Trump destroys those constraints now, they won't exist later. Fourth, the third term issue. Trump's hints about staying beyond 2 terms combined with his defiance of the Supreme Court paint a scary picture. What happens in January 2029 when his term ends? Is he going to voluntarily leave office? Or is he going to claim some emergency or some legal theory that lets him stay? And if he does, who's going to stop him? The Supreme Court can rule against him, but if he just ignores them like he's doing now, what's the enforcement mechanism? The military? If he's purged military leadership of anyone who will resist him? Congress? If Republicans are still protecting him, we could be headed for a genuine constitutional crisis over presidential succession. Fifth, what this means for democracy. The rule of law only works if everyone agrees to follow it. If the most powerful person in the country decides he's above the law, that he doesn't have to listen to courts or respect the Constitution, then we don't really have rule of law anymore. We have rule by one person, and that person can do whatever they want until someone with enough power decides to stop them. That's not the system the framers created. That's not what America is supposed to be, but that's where Trump is taking us. So what can be done? Congress could act. They could impeach. They could pass legislation clarifying limits on executive power. They could use their funding authority to constrain Trump's actions, but Republicans won't do it because they're afraid of Trump's base. And Democrats don't have the votes to act alone. The courts can keep ruling against Trump, but as we've seen, he'll just ignore them. State governments could resist. Governors could refuse to comply with unconstitutional federal orders. Attorneys general could sue, but Trump will retaliate, and there's only so much states can do against federal power. The most realistic check is political, public opinion, elections. If voters punish Republicans in 2026 for enabling Trump's constitutional violations, that might force them to act. But if Trump's base stays loyal, if Republican voters don't care that he's defying the Supreme Court, then there's no political price for the behavior. And it continues. We're at a critical moment. The Supreme Court has drawn a line. They've said Trump has gone too far. They've ruled his actions unconstitutional. And Trump has responded by walking out, by refusing to acknowledge their authority, by signaling that he'll keep doing whatever he wants, regardless of what courts say. This is the moment where we find out if the Constitution still means something, if the system of checks and balances still works, if anyone can actually stop a president who's determined to ignore all limits on his power. Trump's walkout wasn't just disrespectful. It wasn't just bad optics. It was a direct challenge to constitutional government itself. He's saying, I don't answer to courts. I don't answer to Congress. I don't answer to the Constitution. I do what I want. And the question now is, will America let him get away with it? Will we accept that the president is above the law? Or will we find ways to enforce constitutional limits even when the president refuses to respect them? The next few months will answer those questions, and the answers will determine what kind of country we are. Stay tuned, because we're watching American democracy being tested in ways it's never been tested before.